He is a professor in the Department of Information Studies. He has studied lots of things at lots of places, including Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. So that the result is he is living interdisciplinary, intercultural example. So he is well qualified to talk today about the project that he is undertaking. His topic today is exploring how cultures and new technologies shape one another. You'll note the dynamic feedback that is implicit in this. Without further ado, because I am not a believer in long introduction, and I think we could start 15 seconds early. Ramesh.
So it's very nice to meet all of you. My name is Ramesh Srinivasan, as Jonathan mentioned. You should feel free to interrupt me with any clarifying questions, or cackling, or bird noises, or what have you. I'm very honored to be here, and I've had some great interactions with faculty members here at USC. And actually, this all came about when I was in India in the last several months, and I met with Ernie Wilson, your dean out there, and he was hearing about some of the work that I'm doing out there, as well as in other parts of the world. And he said, Ramesh, you should really come and share what you're working on with people at USC. So, and then I realized just in the last, few weeks that there's so many dynamic interactions with what I'm working on and with what all of you are working on as well. So I'm very honored to be here. Okay, so I'm a scholar who focuses on global media, global digital new media in particular. I've been working for nearly 10 years on questions of how new media technologies, digital technologies, impact, construct, and shape cultures and communities worldwide. But I'm also interested in the less studied question of how an insight into different cultural ways of viewing the world, different cultural claims toward what knowledge is, different cultural priorities, different cultural value systems actually can impact the design, engineering, and understanding of new media around powerful questions. So as you see here, I'm someone who's on a plane a lot, but I'm also living and working with different communities worldwide in a very careful, thoughtful, and rigorous manner, hopefully. So this takes me from places like Kyrgyzstan, India, and also working extensively with Native American populations. And what we're looking at is the question of how new media technologies interact with such communities in these different parts of the world around really important topics related to economics, developmental policy, cultural heritage and representation, and even diaspora and how diaspora identify and connect with one another. I've been able to approach this line of research through a mixed background that I have, which includes training in ethnography, mixed qualitative and quantitative social sciences, including social network analyses, engineering, and design. So I'm a little bit spastic and all over the place, but this is what an interdisciplinary subject actually is and functions like. The reason why design actually ended up being what I ended up doing my PhD within is because I argue that design actually allows you to translate between qualitative understandings of the world and ethnographic work, and actually living and working with communities, various types of social data, and actually the creation of some sort of functioning media technology or media system, and understanding how that functions within these different locations. So today's talk is actually going to provide examples very briefly from a wide range of projects that I'm conducting in different parts of the world. And these range from partnerships that I've developed closely over time with Native American populations, Indian villages, mostly in southern India, and Kyrgyz citizens in Bishkek, which is the capital city of Kyrgyzstan. And these projects focus on these questions that I'm dealing with here. So what I want to argue about in this talk is that there are three major ways in which you can frame the discussion of how cultural groups worldwide interact with and shape digital technologies, new media technologies, to serve their needs. These are not distinct from one another, but they allow us to look at a variety of mechanisms of appropriation associated with new media projects. So I refer to these as authorship, ontology, and social life and adoption. So when I talk about authorship, what I'm actually talking about is how technologies, media types of technologies that were actually traditionally used to represent a community or document a community actually change their meaning when they're actually placed in the hands of the former subject. So a video camera, for example, is an example of a technology that's been used to tell a story about a community. But when you place that technology in the hands of people to author their own discourses, tell their own stories, we find dramatically different kinds of effects starting to happen. The second topic is ontology. And ontology is a term that is defined in a variety of manners, from philosophy to artificial intelligence to science and technology studies. But there's some common ground across these different disciplines which relates to the basic idea of how different communities and different cultures make claims about how the world actually is. And so the approach I focus on is how we actually develop media projects that actually invoke and catalyze and empower different cultural ontologies, different cultural ways of seeing the world. And of course, when someone tells their own story with a video camera, that is an ontological perspective. But what I'm very interested in with this question of ontology is how we actually engineer new media technologies, new media systems, including databases, how they classify information, who's actually designing the functioning material of systems so as to accommodate different ways in which different cultures actually model their own worlds. And then the third topic, which I'm interested in, is what I call social life and adoption. Now, it's really important to do projects that involve authorship or that looks at different kinds of ontological perspectives, but at the end of the day, we really need to think carefully, especially when we work with global new media, at how those projects actually weave themselves into different community infrastructures, different economic agendas, different political agendas, different social movements. And part of this that I'm going to talk about is actually thinking very carefully when we do media research that's global in its focus, at thinking very carefully about these questions in which the technology and media is actually situated within. So I'm going to argue later in this talk that there are two major parameters we need to think about when we do global digital media projects. One is the question of sustainability. How does that project actually live, adopt, and weave itself in a very sustainable manner in the community and in that new environment? And the second is the question of scale, because we as researchers, especially ethnographers, tend to do very fine-tuned, focused research, which is very important. But at the end of the day, when we're interested in impacting things like policy and social movements and economics, we need to understand how metastructures function. We need to understand how economics and policy making actually function. And in some cases, we actually need to get into the minds of bureaucrats and government officials and more. So this is sort of the start of what we want to look at here. So first of all, when one actually thinks about a technology or a type of media instrument in any form, I want to start by invoking the argument that media and communication technologies in and of themselves are cultural objects. When people create a technology, they have an anticipation of a set of values around how that object, how that system is to be used, and how it is not to be used. There are values laden into the construction of media and technologies in and of themselves. And this is very much at the core of work in science and technology studies, as well as work in media studies in and of itself, as Bruno Latour, the French sociologist, reminds us. A reading into the history of science and technology allows us to understand the social and cultural parameters, forces, and agents that actually construct databases, that construct technologies. Now, given that, does that mean that when we create a technology with particular sets of aims in mind of how that is to be used and how it is to not be used, that that's all that happens, that that's actually how that technology ends up being used? No, not at all. What we find is when we look at the wide world, and media studies work tells us this, that actually that technology can and will be used in many cases in very unanticipated manners. And this is very foundational work in media studies and in cultural studies around appropriation, around social discourses actually forming and reforming the ways in which they imprint themselves around technology. So I just wanted to start by actually allowing us to look at this push and pull, that when we create a technology, we are actually creating, in a way, a system of values and a system of classifying into that technology. But at the same time, when we start to do global work, we actually see in different communities, in different cultural milieus, various types of new uses. So a very obvious example of that, which has been popularized in kind of popular discourse in India, is the example of the mobile phone. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean an imprinting of a new discourse, of a new type of authorship around the mobile phone, but we see people using these technologies, which were built for particular types of aims, in somewhat different types of manners, or at least in different local contexts. So we see a fisherman from Kerala, which is on the southwest coast of India, for example. He was using this phone. This was an image that was in the popular media in India. He was actually using this phone during the tsunami because he was out at sea. The tsunami waves kicked in closer to the coast, and he texted his relatives on the shore saying, "This crazy wave is coming, get off of the shore." Now, this is not exactly an example, again, like I said, of this idea of authorship, but this is an example of local types of uses around this sort of technology, which might have been manufactured in Taiwan and built and designed by Nokia, right? So this is the kind of example of that. There are a number of these kinds of examples. You can scan the popular media in a number of magazines to get a sense of this. However, what I wanted to point to, and again, in media studies, we start to look at some of this kind of work, is the work of a large line of visual anthropologists and people in cultural studies, which have taught us that technologies that might have been used for control and repression historically have actually been appropriated to author oppositional and new types of discourses. So we see examples, for example, that all of you know about, of the Zapatistas, for example, taking control of online networks and news groups to actually author an oppositional discourse which might have actually emerged from a historical technology that was built and engineered by DARPA. So this is an example of this kind of idea. Much work on indigenous media with the Kayapo in Brazil, the writings of Faye Ginsberg, the writings of Terence Turner, have looked at examples of how people, for example, have taken video cameras that might have been used to actually document and engage in surveillance of a particular community. Those local communities in turn appropriate those cameras and actually use the cameras for their own aims, to interview people, to document their own ancestral claims, to actually oppose the existing system. So this is an example of the social and cultural intelligence that exists when people actually are enabled to author using technologies in their own right. So as a graduate student, when I was at MIT, I was very interested in creating community media and information systems. And I was working with refugee communities from Somalia, and I also started working heavily at that point, especially when I went to Harvard, with Native American populations. And what I had observed, which is very common in this school, is when previously the marginalized, those who were subjects of media representation were actually enabled and empowered to tell their own story, author their own narrative, it creates this incredible viral social impact. So based on this, I want to sort of share with you one project that I've been working on in India. This is in the Andhra Pradesh region in India. Now, there's a lot of work on technology, media, and development in India and in different parts of the developing world. A lot of this work kind of crystallizes itself around what's called ICT for development, information communication technologies for development. And I don't want to be overly critical of a lot of this work, but I will say that most of the research that's out there is basically based on the idea that accessing information through technologies, through new media technologies, magically, I won't say magically, but works to transform developmental disadvantages in the developing world. That you access information, whether it's educational, import, crop prices, or more, and then communities start to act upon that information and they develop accordingly. Well, in some cases we have isolated some best practices where that happens. But what I wanted to do is build on this work that I was talking about authorship with these indigenous examples and so on, and actually work to look at how media technologies can be tools of authorship and collective reflection. So I inverted the question to actually look at what happens when, just very simply, when you provide a very fatalistic, ritualized, dominantly non-literate community access to video cameras for people to tell their own story, to document what they want, and share this information with one another. There's a lot of foundational work in anthropology as well as in development studies on this kind of topic. So for example, Arjuna Padarai, well-known anthropologist and now in the Media, Culture and Communication Department at NYU, has written about the capacity to aspire. So what he's actually talking about there is that often marginalized communities, especially non-literate peoples, operate in a very ritualized manner. They see their worlds the way in which it has been constructed in a ritualized sense. And when we develop a type of literacy, we actually view our worlds in new ways. We look at ourselves from a point of departure, from a point of reflection, and say, this is what our community is doing. This is what I'm doing. These are ways in which we can move forward collectively as a community. Amartya Sen's work, for example, on capacities, argues that you have to start a developmental project by looking at the capacities, the shared capacities that are within and across one's own community. And a lot of work on literacy and illiteracy by scholars such as Gideon Watt or Walter Ong have actually argued that literacy in a type of sense actually has a very strong social and cultural impact. So what I was interested in is work in this region. This is Andhra Pradesh, southeast India, but a little further up the coast, actually from the very far south, and in this basic region which is covered by this blue bubble. So what we're looking at in this project is actually thinking very carefully across two villages. These are two villages that I worked in, 70 to 80% lack of literacy, and I wanted to study this reflective video hypothesis. So I did this project over 24 months. One village, here's Kesavaram, that's me with some of the community members sitting on the top of one of the buildings just on the river. And this is a largely fishing and prawn harvesting village, and it also has some rice agriculture at work as well going on there. And we were working here in Kesavaram in this manner. And this is typically how development work functions in communities in India in the context of working with communities. People sit around in circles and they talk about capacities, they talk about developmental disadvantages, and they try to come up with some priorities and strategies of how their community can move forward. Because ultimately when you do a media project, it's not necessarily about the technology, it's about how the technology cultivates and impacts human capacities. So this is the example of Kesavaram. Notice the difference here in Ardavaram. Ardavaram is a second village. These villages are very similar in a variety of demographic manners, and we conducted ethnographic work to try to isolate those factors. Except in this village, the community would meet, and their meetings would actually be based around the functioning and the observation in a very active, critical manner, which I did not prime beforehand, of different pieces of content that people would shoot with these simple on-off video cameras. Okay? So as a function in time, I was interested in what types of social parameters, some of which you can measure in quantitative manners through surveys and so on, many that you can measure through ethnographies, focus groups, and interviews. What are the differential impacts, the simple, not access, but the simple active authorship, the active reflective authorship around those video technologies would have in one village versus the other? So the results were really, really fascinating to us, simply over a two-year period. Very inexpensive investment, but a very interesting set of results. First of all, we saw that in Ardavaram, which is where we introduced the video cameras, development was actually observed as something that the perception of what development was shifted from the idea that the community was a passive recipient of aid, that some NGO or some bureaucrat would actually provide solutions to that community, to something that was actually produced and created by community agency itself. People said, we are actually responsible for our own development. Simply that understanding was a very interesting phenomenon that we saw start to take hold over time. Secondly, we saw this idea of aspiration. People, when we initially were entering and working in these villages, and we were actually invited in through some people from the panchayat level and the NGO level, which is local leadership, we saw that people started to see themselves in ways, and their community in ways that looked at their community differently than the way it had always been. So originally when we were coming in, people would say, well, our community will be the way it was, and it will always be the way it is. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but this sort of tactical, active way of looking at how to shape one's future and one's community's future was largely absent from the discussion. This started to enter into the discourse in our Ardavaram. And we were very carefully selecting focus groups that represented a subset of very important demographic criteria, including caste, gender, and class, which all existed within these villages. The relationship people had to video, the technology itself, which we often see in ICT development projects. People say, why do I need this technology? It's not part of my everyday life. There was a skepticism around video as well. But the act of authorship actually starts to shift from a kind of a vague positive feeling people had about the technology, because that's an initial euphoria that people usually have when they engage with technologies, to a tactical use of the camera. The camera started to be a tactical device. They would use it in very selective, thoughtful, and reflective manners. They would document particular things that they thought warranted documentation. And I can talk more, if you have further questions, about the kinds of videos people created. So this idea that when we actually did individual interviews with different individuals, we didn't just do focus group interviews, we saw that people at the very outset of this project saw their own priorities and their own community priorities as being basically about themselves and their own families. That started to shift over time as well, but where people started to see that the good of the village as a whole was good for them, and the good for them as a whole was the good for the village. So this idea of identity actually being reconstructed and reconfigured around collective types of margins was a very interesting issue as well. So what are some of the capacities of video in and of itself that we started to see? Well, first of all, it's a mobile device. I'm shooting a video here. I hand it off to Josh. He hands it off to Professor Jenkins here, and so on. So it has this mobility to it. It has a viral mobile quality to it, where people can document different types of topics and concepts, and it can move. And that's a very interesting phenomenon that we thought was relevant in the case of this work, particularly because of the fourth issue there. It quickly moved outside of the focus group. It wasn't just a group of focus group members that we were studying, but this actually started to move across the village. People started giving one another the cameras all over the village, and we were very careful not to give people explicit instructions about how to use the cameras, who to use them with. We just made it very open-ended. So people would start screening videos as they would all meet under banyan trees, which are these very, beautiful, enormous public kind of space trees that exist in some of these villages. They would be screening videos on the sides of temples sometimes. So there was this quality of virality. It would move outside of the focus group, and it had this kind of catalytic effect within the community. There was a kinship created amongst video makers. It confronted ritualization, and this evidential use of video is something that a lot of scholars have talked about in the past. When things were done incorrectly by the government or by an NGO, it would be documented in an evidential manner, and that document would be a type of piece of evidence that could be submitted to redress the wrongs that were done for this community. We saw as a function of time people's prioritizations. You can only invest in so much when you do a development project, right? We have limited resources and so on. But people, as a function of time, started to come to some consensus around what they thought and how they thought it could be done in their village, because there were limited resources and so many things people wanted to work on. So this is just an example of authorship. It's a very simple project. It builds on a lot of work I'd done when I was a graduate student, but the results have a lot of power to them that I think we can start to weave in these kinds of insights into how we start to look at kind of media authorship, media literacy projects in the developing world. Okay, ontology.
Can I
so
ask a quick
yes,
question
please.
about the last
Yes.
study? I was wondering, just a clarification question. Could you just describe a few examples of the content?
Sure.
That would really help a lot. And then the other question I had was about distribution. How did they distribute the videos? I mean, you mentioned showing on
Good
the...
question.
But was there any online
Right.
distribution? I doubt it. I mean, given...
Not much online.
Yes.
There were local TV networks that were streaming the videos. They had to follow particular cultural protocols on how the videos should be shown and which videos could be shown. People would also, there's a lot of CD burning and DVD burning capacities in some of these villages. These are not, extremely poor villages, but they do have 70–80% illiteracy rates, which I thought was kind of the interesting phenomenon I wanted to work with. We also saw people one or two times post things on YouTube, but they had to go to the village center. This is one village, but there's about 60 villages that create what we call hamlets in India. So they would go to the village center and post it on YouTube to try to attract large-scale, transnational, potentially, or at least domestic elite attention to come back down on the government. And in terms of the videos that were being documented, it shifted as a function of time from documenting things that were wrong, which I talked about, this evidential quality, to documenting capacities. People started to say, this is how I do this farming technique with sugarcane. And they would actually create that capacity and show that in occupational training programs that existed in the village. Kids would use the video camera, which we all know, how powerful those intersections are. In school, when they would actually try to do and tell stories about their community. So part of like the social studies kinds of curricula started to shift from these very anachronistic types of textbooks, which are basically colonial books, to actually self-created kinds of media projects. People would tell stories about their culture and their community and the ancestral relationship that they had with the larger town in various ways. People would land disputes would actually be documented through video, and then that piece of media would be this shared document people would meet and talk about to actually try to resolve disputes that different families had with one another. So this wide range of uses, none of them primed by us or our team. This kind of speaks to this power of authorship in a way that I think, we already see the mobile phone example and that's celebrated, but I'm talking about another level here. And now I'm just moving this to this whole other level here with this question of ontology. When we think about digital systems, we're actually thinking about information systems which have databases built into them. And this is a really interesting issue because the database itself presents a set of narratives around how information is to be classified, how it's to be retrieved, how it's to be modeled. And this is something that we're very interested in information studies departments. This is an image of an interface of a project I did with Native American communities. So I'm going to try to talk about this question of ontology a little bit. Ontology are ways in which people see the world. It's a way in which a local community, through shared cultural practices, actually starts to model its own world. Think about the topics, the themes, the concepts that it shares, and how those are related to one another. It's not simply an academic departure, but it's an actual language by which we can look at new media technologies. And it's very fundamental to the ways in which cultural difference actually functions in my mind. So I was working, this is back to my dissertation work, I'll just talk about this very briefly. I was invited by the heads of 19 different Native American reservations to go to this part of the world, which is very nearby here, and live and work across the reservation and try to rekindle tribal networks for the Kumeyaay, Cahuilla, Luceño, and Cupeño communities. And they were separated onto all these different reservations that were very spatially fragmented and infrastructurally fragmented from one another. As a result, intra-tribal networks which correlate to economic, social, and political unity and well-being were actually basically fractured. There's a high level of alcoholism, high level of diabetes, very little cultural identity, very little knowledge of shared cultural kinds of forms of identity making. So I was invited out there, and it's really cold in Boston, so I took off, and I would especially spend all my winters out in this region. It's just a desert region east of San Diego. And these were people that were traditionally seafaring communities. They lived and they had an ancestral relationship with the sea. But as a function of time, when the reservation systems and sort of colonialism started to happen, they moved into this sort of fragmented distribution inland from the sea, because where some of these communities are today is La Jolla, California, and so on. So this is sort of a GIS map that I did of the communities I was working with. And you see that there are some roads that connect the communities, but they are very spatially and infrastructurally fragmented, meaning that these are all mountains. These are the sides of desert mountains that you can't do much agricultural work on, and it's far away from the sea. So getting from one of these reservations to another, even though as the crow flies it might be 50, 60 miles, actually takes sometimes as much as 3-4 hours. Very little in terms of social networks across the reservations. So I was interested in a manner similar to work I'd done in the past, in building a type of system that could share authored information across the communities and allow change makers and leaders in these communities to identify needs, resurrect the schools or resuscitate the schools, allow new types of economic networks to be developed, and so on. And I was very interested in that in the context of this work with these communities. And part of that was actually meeting people across the reservations, building focus groups and coalitions across the reservations, and getting people across the reservations through very cheap digital technologies that they had been given access to by the state government, as well as a wireless internet connection across the reservations to try to create a system where people could share media, share content. This is in 2002 that I was doing this work, and it went on till 2005. And this is Jane Dumas, a medicine woman from one of the reservations, from the Hamul reservation. And part of this, doing really strong ethnographic work, involves actually seeking out her blessings. And she becomes this sort of a real leader of the project, not just in terms of the system, but in terms of the system's social manifestation. So when one does networked media projects, one really needs to think about the networks that connect communities pre-existing the technology and build on top of those things. But what's really key here is this diagram. People would create content because they had this grant from the state government. They would share all this content with one another. But how would they sort of work with that content to create an ontology by which the system would actually function? So this is an image of a diagram that the people that I was working with across the communities actually created. It's a mapping of different concepts, topics, priorities, and more that are shared across the reservations. And this is a dynamic diagram. People are constantly changing this diagram. But what's interesting here is it's a way in which people decide they locally organize their knowledge, their ways of seeing the world. And the reason why this is relevant is this actually becomes the architecture of the database and of the media system itself. So when people upload pieces of content, whether it's a video, photo, or text, they actually annotate those pieces of content with different topics, different nodes in this ontology. And what you see that's interesting here is this is a mapping that reflects collective memory as well as collective aspiration. And that I think is very interesting. There are topics here like order, creation, medicine people. The ocean is there, which I said there was this ancestral relationship to, but none of the communities live anywhere near. Yet at the same time, these goals of distance learning, labs and equipment, literacy, sovereignty, that's a huge contemporary goal that a number of communities have. These are also framed into the discussion here. So people would actually upload and share content as a function of time. This project had very strong impacts in a variety of manners. People across the reservations would see certain needs that they could create local businesses around. The schools started to adopt this system into their curricula, and this was the way the system functioned. The videos were actually mapped to an interface that they designed themselves, which is a very holy tree called the manzanita tree, and they were actually grafted on the branches of the system itself. And when people would actually choose different topics and nodes from this ontology, pieces would be retrieved based on their annotation to those topics. So as a function of time, people were constantly, not constantly, but they were about 10% usage across the communities. People were adding content on an average about 10 to 20 clips per month. And it started to grow as a function of time. And we did longitudinal social network analyses, and we saw a creation of a number of what Robert Putnam calls bridging ties, weak ties that existed across reservations. And that's very interesting because that bridging tie is the key to actually allowing previously distinct bodies of resources to actually bridge in their way. But also a reinforcement of certain types of bonding ties, which are very important to cultural identity. And a lot of anthropologists have actually argued that the lack of cultural identity highly correlates to a number of issues, problems that people identified across these reservations related to violence and a growth in drug use and so on. So I wanted to take this, I spoke about this extremely briefly, I could talk about this for hours.
But remember, you want to leave some time for questions.
Exactly, so we got maybe 10 minutes left, okay? So I wanted to take this work and take it a lot further. And so I was really interested because I had this really strong connection with a number of Native American communities that I met through my work with these communities at thinking about how we start to look at these systems that have started to proliferate our world that share cultural knowledge in its various forms. You know, they call it tangible and intangible cultural heritage. That's a UNESCO term. And part of that is what started to emerge with the museum. Again, the museum as an institution has started to create these digital manifestations where images and other types of scanning of content in museums are starting to be digitized and shared with the larger world. And part of that is a very important question that's classic to all museums and even libraries and so on, which is the question of how we represent that content and whose voices are actually influencing the ways in which we actually look at that content in and of itself. So I was working very closely through some connections I had with the Zuni, and I started to meet a number of people in museums around the world, including at the Smithsonian, but I developed a very close partnership with the philosophy of science scholar who also happens to be the director of Cambridge in the UK, Cambridge University's Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. And they were building this big digital museum initiative, but they were very interested in looking at whose voices could be represented around objects like this. So what's interesting is this essentially and I think about Apadure's Social Life of Things idea book here, actually. This object has a set of narratives associated with it. It's a piece of pottery that came from Zuni, but it also has an archaeological narrative associated with it, right? Because archaeologists have their own languages by which they talk about these objects, and those are legitimate languages. But it also has a curatorial and museum studies type of language, which is another way of telling a story about this object. But the Zuni have their own way of talking about this object. And I'm very interested in creating a web, or thinking about how we can influence the future of new media to tell different stories, to allow different ontologies to start to proliferate our digital world. And that's a very important element of what I try to work on. So what we did is we actually went to the community, and here's your good old Venn diagram. I apologize for the size of some of these letters here, or the words here. But this on the left is what the Zuni say about a set of pieces of pottery and shards that we actually shared with them. And on the right is what the catalog says. There's not much overlap here. Now, what are the fundamental differences that the Zuni have to say about those objects? Well, first of all, the Zuni locate these objects, they contextualize these objects around stories, around narratives. Narratives are not just stories for the sake of stories or stories for the sake of cultural identity, but they're also mnemonic devices. They're ways in which we actually remember who we are as people. And a lot of people like Walter Ong have written about this. But also, they contextualize these objects in terms of their uses. These objects are associated with practices, right? So for me, it's very interesting to, when one looks at these differences versus this very specialized language of archaeologists and museums, how we can build systems that share these types of ways of looking at objects as well as these on the right. What is the possibility of creating systems that accommodate multiple ways of seeing the world, multiple ontologies? And at the very end of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about Web 2.0 and does it actually do the trick or not? I'm saying not really. So these are actually very important because these are culturally shared worldviews. They're legitimated because they persist and they form cultural identity. So, okay, that was very brief on ontology. There's a lot I can say about that and a lot of different projects that are going on. We just got a big grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services from the federal government to now actually pool the collections of 8 different museums around the world with the Zuni and with a number of other Southwest American tribes. And we're trying to continue to build the system. And what we're actually writing about in an NSF application that's under review, National Science Foundation application under review right now, is how do you build systems that share information according to complex adaptive theory, the ways in which multiple ontologies can exist on top of one another without subjugating them to a single type of ontological perspective, which is this meta-ontology that we see in museums. So I'm getting a little philosophical, but this is something that I'm really thinking about the power of complexity and the power of difference and the power of diversity in terms of this question of different worldviews. So, okay, so I talked about these questions of authorship and ontology, but it's really important to really think about when one does global media work, and I found this out the hard way and really by really working and getting gritty in these projects, that it's really important to actually think about how the initiative itself weaves itself into an ecology and a set of institutions and infrastructures that exist in these different parts of the world. If you develop a project and it has ethnographic power to it, that's wonderful because that often correlates to sustainable uses of the project and sustainable adoptions and appropriations, but that doesn't necessarily deal with the larger issue at hand, which is scale, which is policy, and so on. So these are the 2 topics I just want to touch on, and then we'll finish up this talk. One is sustainability, and sustainability has to do with the idea of allowing that media project to actually be absorbed into one's own local infrastructures in a way where it's owned, formed, reformed, shaped, and reshaped in a variety of manners that are appropriate to that community itself. And we see a lot of data, and I've collected a lot of data that shows that when people themselves are invested in the active design and authorship around the project, it correlates to sustainability. And a lot of my work on local ontologies actually demonstrates this. Okay, but scale is also a very tricky issue because of its interaction with policy and policy making. You need to be locally cognizant, but you also have to understand how the initiative is situated within a set of power structures, power dynamics, other forces, other politics, and more. So what I wanted to talk about is what I'm working on now in India, which is another initiative with a very leading and very brilliant developmental economist who's based in Chennai. And I wanted to actually refer to the idea of, to the book actually by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State. In case you haven't read it, it was very influential in my own work, which actually talks about how states see phenomenon, how states see and model and construct data around communities. Now, independent of the discussion of power and so on, I just wanted to make the argument that it's actually a question of mismatched ontologies. The ways in which this phenomenon, this is really common by the way during the monsoon in India, we call this waterlogging. But this is actually, what happens is local communities, the way they describe this phenomenon is by about 72 different terms, and none of those terms are present in the state-created information systems that are actually built with the aim of actually getting citizens in a very journalistic, grassroots way to actually share information about what's going on in their communities. So independent of digital divide questions, which are often about access and are a little bit out of mode these days, it's actually a question of mismatched ontologies. These two ways of seeing the world are not being reconciled. And this is very interesting given the work that I was talking about earlier about the Zuni and the digital museums and more. So when one sees like a state, they actually have to model information in ways that are comparable, generalizable, statistically operable, and more. That's generally speaking how this works. But waterlogging itself is described according to local ontologies and local manners that make meaning and are powerful for local peoples themselves. So there are these kinds of systems which are very powerful and very interesting. And I was speaking to Clay Shirky about this the other day, and he didn't know that this system existed in India because he was trying to develop something similar to this for the Obama administration. But this is a public grievance system. This exists in India. In fact, there's 3 different versions of this. Local peoples, local communities in a variety of regions can actually upload grievances, but they have to tag that grievance with a particular type of vocabulary and framing that actually often misconstrues and actually distorts the meaning of the actual ontology that people are talking about in the first place. Now, why is this important? Well, when we want to actually think about democracy and new media, Web 2.0 and democracy, citizen journalism, global new media, we need to think about those cultural worldviews, those cultural ontologies. Now, whoops, I have to just get to this in a minute. So my question that I want to just kind of talk about with this question of scale is really, can we think about ways to create media, to create digital systems that share those different ontologies, that allow those gaps in knowledge to actually start to be bridged? Again, that's a subject that I'm very interested in that I kind of referred to earlier. So that's the question of scale. Another question of scale, and this is just the last project I'm going to talk about, actually is really focused on the idea of how an initiative, how a media initiative or a new project actually absorbs itself, as I mentioned, into social movements and social institutions that exist within that location. So I was very interested. I did about 2 summers of work, and I recently published a paper related to politically subversive bloggers in Kyrgyzstan, in the nation state of Kyrgyzstan. Now, it's an interesting case study because this is the only country in Central Asia, former Soviet Union, where the internet is not regulated. It's not censored, which has actually created this movement where people are exploiting these deregulated networks and platforms to actually author highly critical discourses about the government. And so what we were interested in is looking at how this movement and the technology coalesced with one another, right? The openness of the technology coalesced with the sort of the movement itself that was pre-existing but catalyzed by the technology itself. So we did a number of ethnographic type pieces of research with people who are political bloggers. We were trying to understand the relevance of this as a social phenomenon, and we were trying to understand what this means in terms of an ecology of citizen journalism that's starting to happen in the country, grassroots news production, and more. So this is the kind of work that we were doing in Kyrgyzstan, and I can tell you a lot about what we found out. If you have any questions, we need to take some questions. But the point here is that, again, there was this movement that existed outside of the technology itself, and that was key for thinking about scale as well as thinking about sustainability. So this is kind of what I mean when I think about social life and social adoption. And I'm also thinking about John Seely Brown's work on the social life of information and more. So, okay, last set of thoughts, and then I would love to have a short discussion with you all. One is, I'm really interested in continuing to push these issues further, obviously. One is really thinking about how we can reconceptualize the global and the local in media studies around ontology. Local ways of seeing the world that exist concurrently with other local ways of seeing the world, and creating media that bridge those types of gaps. Second is this question of Web 2.0 in Google. And I think this is really interesting because Web 2.0 has become a very popular term that conflates a variety of types of local ways of managing and mapping information, usually very personalized ways. Now the question is can we think about tagging and blogging and those types of activities in a way that's similar or different to the kinds of projects that I'm bringing up about culturally shared ways of mapping, modeling, and appropriating information? And I think that's a real question here. How can sort of this, some of the very positive types of language around this Web 2.0 label actually be cultivated into such initiatives? And maybe we can think past sort of the simplistic, individualized way of appropriating and mapping information to really think about different cultural ways of seeing the world, different cultural worldviews, and more. And I think that's really relevant because the systems that dominate our time today have different kinds of capacities of how they open up discourse and limit discourse. And I think a very good example of that is Google. Very powerful, very efficient, very strong mechanism of getting you information that is efficiently produced by a particular type of algorithmic technique. Yet at the same time, as of 1 year ago, when you searched for the term Africa on Google, you wouldn't get a single web page originating from Africa on any of the first 3 pages. 99% of people don't go past page 3. Now, what does this say about whose voices are equipped to tell the story about Africa? Google is not, trying to be anti-Africa, but it is privileging a mass linking phenomenon which highly correlates to who has the ISPs and who has the servers and who has the web pages, right? So how do we build systems that accommodate diversity, that accommodate multiplicity? Because to me, that's the fundamental question around global new media. So that's the other thing. Third is I just wanted to say a few words about a very exciting set of initiatives I think that are being discussed here at USC around working in India. India is a very fascinating place to do this kind of work because there's a critical mass of people interested in media, but there's been very little work in my mind that's methodically looked at a variety of different topics around which media and communications initiatives can actually impact and empower different societies. It's very complex regionally, it's very complex culturally, but questions of literacy, questions of development and economics, questions of public health, these are all kind of separated into a variety of sort of patchwork projects, but there hasn't been an actual defined methodological strategy that deals with that complex phenomenon. And I think it's very interesting and exciting to do such work in India because often I think citizens in India are exposed to a lot of media, but that media tends to be fairly filtered in terms of the authorship behind it. It's largely speaking created by a sort of a mass media, mass corporate type of phenomenon. And it's very, very rarely is it grassroots, is it multiple, and is it locally built around kind of local questions and local issues. So I think the dovetailing of doing such initiatives in India is very exciting, and I think that time has actually started to come. So anyway, I'm being cut off, but this is actually the last slide, so it was ideal. This is my email address. I'm very honored to meet with all of you, and I would love to talk to all of you in the future. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. I would speeches are all right, but please keep both the questions and the speeches short. And the answer.
Sure.
So we can get a number in. Maybe you get another 10 minutes. I'll start with the first question.
Please.
There's a new field that's happening in museum studies where people are actually being trained about how to display art so as to better communicate to those who are going to come and look at it. When you get your difference between how the local community sees it and how how the viewing community sees it in this case. How do you bridge that gap? Because what you're trying to do is get it across in the most effective way possible, and it raises some issues.
A very good question. I think part of that is actually thinking about what the intention is that the viewer has going into being exposed to that art piece or cultural piece, and you know, museums, at least in theory, are very much about our educational institutions that are focused on providing people access to context and stories and narratives around the object. So what I would just say is that I think the goal here is to actually build the mechanism for the person who views the object through a digital system, at least, to be exposed to what they choose to be exposed to, but allow all these things to exist laterally with one another rather than into a sort of neatly packaged kind of efficient structure. And I think that's really important because I think people can choose to engage with objects in the manners that they wish, but I think it's really important that you open it up to allow these kinds of stories that don't neatly fit into very tightly bounded kinds of databases, to actually allow people to access these things in whatever ways they choose to. So I am actually arguing in some of these writings and applications that you need to have multiple things exist concurrently and side by side, and that allow people to make meaning out of their interaction with those objects. Because I think that's what people are actually doing on the web anyway. I think we need to give people credit for what they're good at, which is actually looking at multiplicitous forms of information, critiquing Wikipedia, and so on. So these are the things that I think are very exciting about web users today. And I think we should pay attention to that when we look at the future in museums as well.
We had the opportunity to go and visit the Museum of Native Americans in Washington, D.C. And all the objects that you had up here were objects that were native to their original culture and may have been misappropriated in some ways or not. One of the things that was interesting about the display in Washington is that they had things that were not native to their culture, but showed how the native populations, Indians around the country, interacted with them. Like there was a whole wing that was dedicated just to skateboarding and to surfing, which brought a whole different picture to bear on how you would go about interpreting what constitutes, you know, the Native American experience.
Completely correct, and I think anyone, and the big danger, and I don't want anyone to think this, but the big danger that happens sometimes in museums that aren't as progressive as the National Museum of the American Indian is they create a static representation of what this community is and what it isn't. When I was out working with some of these communities, like back when I was a PhD student as well as now with the Zuni, there are various forms of local hip-hop appropriation that are used to sort of re-identify with collective history and memory. There are various types of cultural acts and practices that are constantly being created and recreated. And I think it's really important that people share who they are now, if they choose to. And I think there's just one other fine-tuned point that I didn't emphasize enough probably, which is that when one works with these communities, you're not just extracting and mining and taking all this information from communities so that we're all better off. You're actually following local protocols. These projects that I do with communities are led by the communities themselves. Data is gathered by the communities. The tribal council really puts us in our place. As I was telling, I was telling you, Sarah, about this. And it's a phenomenon where it's actually, we can look at museums as actually contact zones, which is what James Clifford writes about when he talks about museums, as spaces of interaction and communication. And so that's a really powerful way of looking at it. And I think the NMAI has its handle on this much more so than a lot of other museums. But there's also this phenomenon of tribal museums that's starting to emerge, and we're building coalitions with these local institutions as well.
I really like your three frames of author, ontology, and social adoption, social things. And I also think that the three examples that you gave here are really unique. You have a nation state that has an unregulated internet, so you have this kind of rise of politically subversive blogging. You have two communities that are kind of not poor communities, but they have this high illiteracy rate. And then you have this kind of diasporic Native American community. So I like how you apply those three frames, but I'm thinking of your Google question, and I'm thinking of how you would apply those three frames from a media studies perspective to study something like the Google community, or how this intervenes. I guess I'm asking you to take that provocation of Web 2.0 and go with it a little bit. How this intervenes, or how you can use these frames in a very kind of late capitalist, highly technologized, highly literate consumer society.
It's a great question. When I was speaking to, I spoke to Howard Rheingold recently about some of these projects, and he said, who really, like, he didn't say needs, but who could really engage with these projects is like just technological Americans. I think it's about, I think we see some of this happening. I don't think Google does this, but I think we see systems that are built for very technological communities, that are more heterogeneous communities, where there's enough openness built into the logic of the systems. I'm thinking about things like open source communities, free and open source software communities. Those are more technical, but I think there are examples of systems that exist that I think accommodate for this type of openness to start to manifest itself in local ways. So people can add modules as they wish, they can mash things up as they wish, they can share what they choose to, but they can just locally access other things. But I think it's important that Google allows people the option to understand at least the ways in which they are constructing models of what knowledge is and how it functions digitally. I think at the very least it needs to start to do that, and I think we need to also really think about how we reprioritize other ways in which it's a pretty hermetic system, and other ways in which we can map and mash up and actually access the kind of the guts, the algorithms, the code within these systems, and allow those who are actually interested in these questions. I'm a former engineer, like, to actually build some of these kinds of modules or different kinds of projects on top of it. But I think it's a great question, and it's something that I need to think about more as well.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm thinking about the idea of internationalized domain names, and how the lack of internationalized domain names prevents so many people from accessing information in certain, for example, you don't get, certain people have lack of access because they can't type in the simple domain name in the Roman character. So how does your framework work on something like that?
I mean, these are just really basic problems of sort of lack of access and lack of authorship. It fits perfectly within my frame, but I don't think my projects resolve those questions. I think it's really important I don't think it will be too long before that issue is solved, because I think the prevailing discourse, as I mentioned, around digital divide and so on, ICTD, is about equal access, equal participation, but equal access, I think, to information. And I think that's a great thing, but I think this question of authorship and reflection has these kinds of socially contagious types of phenomena occur around them that I think are really, really powerful. And I think that's sort of like where I'm trying to go with my work. Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking that, if there's such a lack of access to this, it definitely sort of skews the views online. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. It turns out that Ramesh has a meeting with Dean Wilson at 1 o'clock, so we probably ought to draw a line under it for the moment.
Dean Wilson? We're old buddies.
Dean Wilson, do you have a question? First one, open and transparent.
I'm in favor of open and transparent. Unambiguous is what it is. But Ramesh and I have had the opportunity to have some of these conversations in Bangalore and in Los Angeles. I think if you want to have one or two more questions,
Yeah, I would love that.
I'm happy to
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
wait a bit.
Sandra will
Great.
have the next one, but let me just announce that for those of you who are students, you can meet with Ramesh, since you can't stay afterwards here, but he is meeting at 3:30 in ELCA. So if you want to get together with him then, you've got some time to spend with him.
I've really enjoyed meeting the folks that I have had a chance to meet. And please, if you have any time, come and inspire me and critique what I'm working on and help me.
Sandra?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating set of projects, and you raise a lot of really pretty basic storytelling type of issues. I'm wondering, what are the consequences that you've observed at the collective level?
In which initiative?
Of engagement,
Yeah.
you know, in the different sites. What difference is it making in terms of the collective lives of
Good.
those
Yeah,
communities?
great question. I didn't touch upon that methodically enough, I think with the Tribal Peace Project, which is the work that I did as a PhD student with those 20 reservations, an owned media system that's web-based, that is actually owned by people in the community. But like I said, with that social life question, they've had to develop capacity to be able to model, map, change the algorithms, work on the system. So those sorts of capacities have had to be developed around it. But major effects of that project are very much educational. So schools, because in the Native American schools, it's really crazy, but you're on the reservations, and in the schools, in the reservations, the material they're being exposed to about themselves is not written by themselves. It's being written by quite radically misrepresented authors, unintentionally, I'm sure, but so now in the context of learning about their community and their history, they're actually playing with the system, which is nice. It's this active constructionist kind of idea where they're making media and so on. So that's one thing. Second thing, public health. There's a lot of tribal remedies and tribal medicines that are now being digitized and shared and preserved and placed in the online platform. Third, language and literacy. This is growing significantly because people are putting curricula up online and sharing it across the reservations. Fourth is politics. It's creating these sort of contested spaces of dialogue where people are debating whether to have casinos on the reservation, their attitude toward the state government, attitude toward the federal government, attitude toward Harrah's and all these guys are coming in, investors and stuff like that. So these are active, it's kind of an active space, quantitatively not accessed by more than 10% of the people, highly correlated to youth. But I think when we talk about access to these systems, that doesn't necessarily mean that elder people are not involved, but they aren't involved in the first order layer of actually clicking on things and adding things and so on. But their voices are actually directing a lot of what's going on there. But I err on the side of making these very open spaces, and then when problems and issues flare up, I believe that the community itself can come up with solutions to it. So that's that one. The Zuni project is really interesting. We've empowered a tribal museum to lead these projects that is led and owned by the Zuni themselves. They are now getting large amounts of capital. They're building a technology initiative that's serving as a best practice for a lot of other tribal museums. They're building connections and networks. And hopefully this is a model that can influence other types of museum practice. The India project, I'm hoping it can influence more and more people, this literacy video initiative. I've started to try to show this data in forms that sees like a state to government officials and policymakers. I'm not sure yet what the impacts are going to be, but I know that this project hopefully will influence other types of praxis-based engagement in different communities. And finally, I think the work with The Economist in India is actually really powerful because we have the ears of a large number of people on the government sector who are interested in the Ministry of Information Technology in India. They're very interested in this question of mismatched ontologies because it actually does fit a very technical question that people are interested in there. They like technical solutions to cultural questions, which is of course part of the problem, but I think we can bridge this here. I think we can start to build that onto the e-grievance, the public grievance system, into some of these e-governance systems. And if we create ways to dynamically map vocabularies and stories and ontologies, we have done some service, I think, to a large number of users. About 2% of the country is actively engaged with e-governance systems in India. So not a high number, but when you're talking about 1 billion people, you've got a relevant phenomenon here. So.
Thank you so much. Peter, do you want to announce next week?
Yeah, our speaker next week is Erica Weintraub Austin. She's from Washington State University, and the topic of her presentation will be opportunities in media literacy and mediated approaches to substance abuse programs. So come and join us all next week, and Ramesh.
Thank you all.
Very much.